Roberto is the trustee professor of management at Bryant University. Prior to joining Bryant, he served on the faculty at Harvard Business School. Mike is the author of numerous simulations and multimedia cases, and notably is the co-creator of the award-winning Everest Leadership and Team Simulation and the Columbia Space Shuttle Multimedia Case Study. Mike will talk about the many different ways to successfully connect with students and leverage tech tools to create meaningful class discussions in online and hybrid classes. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Sandy. Hello, everyone. It's so great to be with you. I want you right away, as we begin, to picture the absolute worst learning experience you had as a student, where you were totally disengaged in a particular class. What did it feel like? What were your emotions? Why were you so disengaged? What were the impediments to your motivation and your learning in that case? Do you remember that day as a student, whether it was in college or in primary school? Okay, you've got that picture in your head. Now, I want to think about your time as a professor, as a teacher, okay? And I want you to take, since we're just beginning the webinar, let's talk about the first day of class. So important, the first day of class, right? What do you do on the first day? Are you excited like me, like it's Christmas morning, it's the first day of class, right? I'm so excited, I'm gonna go in there and we're gonna go over the syllabus. Oh, what a way to crush the engagement of your class, right? Going over the syllabus, right? We all have done it, but it's not the way you want to begin that first day, right? The science, the research shows, the students, you know, they judge you and they judge your class. You know, unfortunately, we say they shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but they judge you in the first few minutes of the very first class session. And so we've got to grab them right away with something interesting, with something that shows them that the material in your class matters to them. They understand the so what. You've got to show you're passionate about the material, right? And this is really key. The first day of class, what happens? Do you grab them with a powerful active learning experience right at the get-go? Or do you go through the syllabus, right? Do you go through the syllabus? I would argue, you know, you've got to grab them. And it's really key to think about architecting, designing those first 10 minutes. What's it going to be like? Now, for me, I asked them to do some work even before the first day of class. So I have some fodder for the discussion, for the activity we're going to do. But even if you don't do that, you can design those first few moments. But it helps too if you know those students a little bit before they walk in that door. That will help you design a great opening experience. So how you start out in those first few moments, that's the first step toward engaging your students. Put the syllabus on the web. Handle it at the end of the first week or the end of the first class. Don't handle it at the beginning. Don't go through that material that way. What did your first few thoughts about that poor learning experience look like? Well, you know, it's really interesting. I have a feeling for some of you, for many of you, you may have thought of something like the scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where Ben Stein, actually an economist, but who's acting in the movie, is pretending to teach high school economics. And he's, you know, repeatedly saying, anyone, trying to get someone to interact with him and answer his question. And the student faces look like the young lady there, pictured in the scene from the movie. Hopefully you haven't had too many of these experiences in your class, but this is sort of the epitome of the disengagement. You know, the teacher trying to ask questions, but for whatever reason, getting no response. So, you know, I hear this all the time from colleagues, and I've experienced it myself. We're trying to teach interactively. We're asking the questions. We're not getting the responses. So how do we design the experience so that we try to interact, right? How do we get them where they are responding to us, if you will? Well, think about how we design our courses. You know, it's an interesting article that I read about the doctors and nurses at the Newton Wellesley Hospital in Massachusetts, near where I live. You know, they set out to sort of redesign the experience in their lobbies and waiting rooms at the hospital. They wanted to improve patient satisfaction. And they did something really interesting. They went and visited with the management and the staff at JetBlue Airlines, who they regarded as having pretty high customer satisfaction and a good customer experience in an industry not exactly known for satisfying customers. And so they went there, and one of the things that doctors and nurses realized is, our hospital, whether there are examination rooms, whether they're the waiting rooms, whatever it might be, they're designed to meet the doctor's needs, the nurse's needs, not necessarily the patient's needs, right? So this is really powerful. Like, are we designing our classes, right, to meet our needs or their needs? And so engagement begins with being able to empathize with the student. And that's hard to do if, like me, it's been over 20 years since I've been a student. So how do we make sure we do that? And I read a great article recently about a couple of universities that did something pretty interesting. They challenged a group of their faculty to learn how to solve the Rubik's Cube, all 6 sides, right? And they gave them a limited amount of time to do it. They gave them some educational videos and other materials to do it. And they asked them all to try to learn this and then to produce a video showing them solving the cube by the end of whatever period of time, however many weeks. Why did they do this with their faculty? They wanted the faculty to be able to empathize with students learning something really challenging and new that they've never learned before. And a lot of faculty came away from that experience recognizing that, I've kind of forgotten what it's like to be in the student's shoes. So being able to stand in their shoes and empathize with it, so important as you're designing your teaching plan. Instead of just thinking about it like, what am I setting out to do? Think about it as, what's it going to be like for them? And what's it going to be like in their shoes as they experience this? So key. So empathy, very important. So 2 key ideas to start. How do you start the first day, that powerful moment? And second, making sure right from the get-go that you're empathizing with the student and thinking from their perspective, not designing from your perspective, right, and what you're trying to accomplish. Engagement. Teddy Roosevelt said, nobody cares how much you know until they know that you care. To me, engagement is about showing the students you care and building rapport with the student. And this is something we all say we care about our students, but demonstrating that and really getting to know them and letting them get to know you. And some of us want to sometimes put up a little bit of a wall and maybe we're, I don't know how much I want them to let them know me. But the research is pretty clear that if you build this knowledge of one another and build that relationship, they will learn more. They will learn more. And oh, by the way, you'll enjoy teaching a lot more as well. This is very, very powerful. Nobody cares how much you know until they know you care. And so for me, that begins by trying to get to know them even before the first day of class, but then during those first few weeks as well. So let me offer a few ideas on how you can do this, right? So for many years, I went with the simple index card, right? And on the first day of class, I asked them to answer a series of questions, to jot a bunch of stuff down on an index card. And in the drawer here in my office, I have index cards going back 15 years. What's wonderful about that actually is when alumni come back to visit, I'll go back and look at their index card. Where were they from? What were their interests? Did they play a sport? And it really helps me to then engage in conversations with former students. But my primary objective with the index card, of course, is to get to know them a little bit. Not just so I know them a bit, but so that I can use some of that knowledge in the classroom, right? So when we get to, a case study where we might be studying a travel company, and I know there's a student who's passionate about travel, I'm going to draw them into the discussion, right? Or if I've got someone who's from a particular major at our school, well, then I'm going to leverage that if we're covering a particular topic, say in accounting or finance within my course. So I'm going to use what I've learned in the classroom. I'm not just going to do it so I know who they are, right? And I've had some pretty fun experiences. The very first day of class, actually, we do have a little bit of material that we know online that our registrar provides us about them, right? Where they're from and a few things. So we do have a little bit we can review before the first day of class. And I looked up and I noticed this young man who happened to live in the same town that I live in, about an hour from campus. That's where he'd grown up. I didn't know him. But I called on him the first day, and toward the end of class, I said, do you know, Mark, why I called on you? And he goes, oh, it's because you live on Appleyard Lane in Holliston, where I live. And I was like, whoa, how does he know where I live? And he'd done some research too. And it was pretty funny, but it was a great moment of connection. I had learned about him, he'd learned about me. He really, you know, he smiled like that I cared. And I was really, you know, touched by the fact that he cared enough to try to learn a little bit about his professor before the first day. So the index card's a great technique. Now with, of course, COVID, I've begun to embrace some other technologies with doing more hybrid and remote learning. So I've tried Google Forms as a way and this you can do before the first day of class, ask them some questions and get them to respond. Even more fun, I've used VoiceThread, which is a technology where you can build a video and then others can comment on your video through either text or other video. And so what I did is I created a little 5-minute introduction of myself. And I went out in my backyard and I shot a little video and I uploaded it through VoiceThread. And then I asked them to comment on my video by introducing themselves. And they all can see all the videos. So they're not only am I learning about the students, they're learning about one another before the first day of class. And so this is a wonderful little technology, VoiceThread, where you can have students generating some video of one another. But if you want to go simpler and, you know, without any expense, Google Forms is perfectly fine. You can, of course, do a number of other things to get them to share. And then, of course, the old index cards work pretty well in addition to that. But building that rapport starts with understanding who are these people in my class, where are they from, et cetera. And it's always wonderful to be able to do that. And so finding some connection, I always look for connection. Oh, here's a student who studied abroad in Italy. And, you know, my parents and my brother are immigrants from Italy. And so where did you study? Where did you travel? This is where my brother grew up there, and all these wonderful connections. Or where a student has interned, perhaps. Any connection I can find, I'm looking for. Then the thing I do in the first few weeks is I post some voluntary times when we can get together. We can get together. They're not office hours. And the rule of these meetings is we don't discuss the class. Right? They're not office hours, and we don't discuss the class. We go have coffee or we have lunch, as you see some pictures of some students here, and we get together. In COVID now, we've been doing this outside, socially distanced. We keep our masks on. We don't eat together for safety reasons. But we've done this, you know, we tried to adapt our methodology. But that chance over a cup of coffee to talk about, you know, what are your interests? What do you want to do with your career? Are you interested in grad school? Nothing about the course, just about them. I ask them also about what makes a great class? What would you like to see in a great class? What are some of your favorite teaching and learning methods and techniques? I get some ideas from them. And, you know, they're purely voluntary, and yet I get 90% participation. Everybody signs up. Everyone signs up, and I get so many notes of appreciation. Wow, you sat down with us for 45 minutes. I do these in groups. So I'm not doing individual meetings with every student. I do them in groups of, say, 6 to 8. And it's a great way to get to know students. You can do a little larger if you've got a larger class. And you can obviously do this remotely as well. But as much as you can do it in person, if you're able, it's a great way to build rapport. And again, you're using what you've learned during the semester, right? And it might mean, you know, dropping a note to a student saying, how's the job search going? Or, you know, can I help you? Or connect with me on LinkedIn. I might be able to help you with your job search. You can build on what you've learned to then work with the student. What you're trying to do, of course, is get them to the point where they are really motivated to invest in your class and to work really hard. Very powerful. Once you start to build rapport, the other key to having that class where you say, you ask a question and they don't just sit there while you say anyone, is you have to make it safe for them to speak up. So my good friend and co-author on the Ever simulation and on other cases we've done together is Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School. And Amy, of course, is one of the preeminent scholars on the topic of psychological safety. Do you create a climate within your classroom where the students feel comfortable speaking up, asking a question, taking an interpersonal risk, and perhaps putting an idea out there that they might not be sure, you know, is actually a good answer, if you will, right? To remember, the students are self-censoring all the time. They're always worried about the impression they're going to make on you. And that impression management is getting in the way of their learning, right? Because they're reticent. So you've got to make it safe for them to come forward. Now, I cold call though. You'd say, wait, Mike, that doesn't look like a very safe environment. You're cold calling them all the time. Why do I do that? Well, I don't want the same 3 people talking all the time. That's not an engaging class, right? So I want to make sure I get broad participation, and I do want to hold the students accountable for doing the preparatory work. So I do cold call. Now, for students who are really reticent or come from a culture where they're not used to that, or for whatever reason they're having trouble, I might use the warm call, where I'll say to them maybe at the end of the previous class, or in a note before class, or even in the hallway before class saying, I'm coming to you today, Sally, or John, I'm coming to you, right? Or, you know, Julio, I'm going to ask you a question today. Give them a little chance to think and try to get them engaged if the cold call is really so frightening for them. So I am going to cold call, but I'm going to make it safe to do so. So what I tell them is, you know, that in my class, right, there's no downside to wrong answers. There's no downside to maybe not quite getting it right unless you're totally unprepared. If you're unprepared, hey, there's a downside to a comment where you show you didn't do the work before class or you weren't listening to your classmates. But if you get out there and you're not sure, if I call on you and you don't know, you know, it's okay. And I very quickly follow up with a phrase that I use all the time, which is help them out, help him out, help her out, help them out. And I turn to their classmates and I sort of ask them, come in, rescue them. Don't let them flounder, you know, bolster your classmate, you know, contribute, get in there. And people feel so relieved. Oh, I wasn't left out there dangling out on a limb. Right, professor didn't let me just wither on the vine, right, with all those eyes staring on me. I'm going to jump in there, help them out. My favorite phrase, and I've asked students, they love the phrase, right? They love that I've made it safe. But I do something more. I ask the students, so I do grade them on participation. They get a fair, as many of you do, but I don't grade them in a traditional way. It's not simply my view of how well they're contributing. I don't grade them on how often they speak. I grade them on their thoughtful contribution. I give them some guidelines on what thoughtful contribution looks like and how they might contribute. And then each day I select 3 students. I select 3 students and I hand them a sheet of paper that looks like this, and I grade out the names, but it has a roster of the whole class there. And I tell the students, I don't want you tracking how often people talk. That's not the goal. I'm giving you the roster just so you see all the names and have them in front of you. And then what I say is, what I'd like you to do, those 3 students, at the end of class, you don't need to put your name on it. I want you to hand me back the sheet of paper. I want you to tell me who you think the top 3 contributors to our collective learning were that day. Top 3 contributors to our collective learning that day. Now, first of all, those 3 students are really paying attention, right? Because they've been given this incredible responsibility. I'm being asked by the professor to help do this, right? But what I say to them, no negative comments. You're not being asked to tell me who really stunk today, who really, you know, faltered today. There's nothing negative that you're going to give me. You're only going to tell me who the 3 shining stars were today that helped you learn. Not who spoke the most. Someone could end up there having made one comment or maybe just asked a great question. Someone who's brave enough to say, Professor, I don't really understand this. I'm not sure if my classmates do either. Could you help clarify? If they were brave enough to ask that, maybe that for you that day was a really a great contribution. So I asked them to do this. So every class session, I'm getting 9 names. There may be some overlap, but I'm getting 3 sheets of paper with 3 names on each. And then different people are going to have this task all semester. By the end of the semester, I've got this incredible rich body of evidence on what people thought about their peers' contributions to their learning, and I can use that to help me grade participation. But why does this have to do with psychological safety, and why does this make people willing to speak and contribute, not just because they're worried about their grade? Well, it's because, remember, there's no negative element here. You're never punished for a wrong answer. You're only rewarded for contributing to the learning. And the only thing I track, I tell them, that's negative is I track those who are unprepared. And so this idea of creating psychological safety is so vital. And one key, I believe, is how you handle the cold call, how you handle calling on students in general, and how you handle participation and the grading associated with it. I think the other key to psychological safety, and this is a tough one because it does depend on the literal architecture of your classroom. right? The literal architecture of your classroom. But I would say this, that, the podium is your enemy. Especially with young faculty, I think sometimes they clutch the podium. It's like a life vest, a life raft, right? And they're just clutching it, right? They don't want to leave it. They've got their notes there, they've got their laptop there or their tablet, and they're standing there, right? It's very hard to engage the student and then make them feel safe speaking up if you are this distant authority, this sage on the stage behind the podium. So shed the podium. Shed the podium. This is unnerving for many of you, but it's so important. Get out there in the middle of the students and talk to them, be with them, interact with them, right? I teach from the middle, not from the front. In fact, I like to say in my classrooms, there's no front or back, right? I teach from the middle, right? I teach in the middle. I wander around too. Now with COVID, I can't do that as much. So this has been a challenge. I can't wander around because of social distancing. But I still try to shed the podium, other than making sure I stay within camera range if I've got hybrid students. So I'm mindful of that, but I'm making sure I don't bury myself behind a big podium. That barrier, it's a physical, but it's also a psychological barrier to engagement that I think is really important. So being able to shed that is really key. Okay, time for a question for you, a poll question. We're going to ask you about how often you break up your instruction and change the pace or flow of your class sessions. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds here to go ahead and respond to this poll, and then we'll share the results, and I'll talk a little more about my approach on this. So maybe another 15 seconds to respond, and then I'll, for those who can't see the results, hopefully everyone can see them once we show them, but I'll also articulate what we're finding here. Give you about 5 more seconds to go ahead and respond. Awesome, great participation. All right, so what do we got here? Results. So the highest number here is in the 12 to 15 minute range. 28% of you listed, 28% of you said every 12 to 15 minutes. 27% said every 17 to 20. 21% of you said every 27 to 30 minutes. And interestingly, the fewest number of you said every 7 to 10 minutes, the fewest number of you said. And yet, Julie Schell from the University of Texas shared with us at a workshop for our faculty, research showing that, based on current students and the way they think and learn, that we should be changing the pace and the flow of our instruction every 7 to 10 minutes. We're all operating. In fact, I know as a business school professor who uses case studies, if you look at all the teaching notes that I've written and that many of my mentors wrote, they would have pastures of discussion. And they typically would be between 15 and 25 minutes long. But yet, with today's students and in today's environment, and with what we know about the science, every 7 to 10 minutes is probably the right time for us to begin to change the pace and flow of instruction. And so here we are. I went a little too long before I started to change the pace and flow of instruction, even just now. It's very, very important. So what might this look like in a class, and how might this play out? So here you have, in the middle, you have my colleague Allison Butler here from our psychology department teaching. She's teaching from the middle in a class, and students are not in rows. They're sitting in pods because she's going to do some collaborative work with them in class. But there's a whole bunch of things you can do besides just leading, either lecturing to them or leading a discussion that's a plenary discussion. What can you do to break up the pace or flow of that class? Well, you can have some video that you interject to get them to react to. So YouTube's a great source. Other sources of video, you could play a video that might happen, right? You can get the students up out of their seats if possible. And here you see in the bottom left of the screen, they are getting up and sharing work that they've done or ideas, and they're drawing on and they're writing on whiteboards. So a number of students are doing this. This is a great element that you can use. You can use polling software. We just use the Zoom polling software. You can use something like Poll Everywhere. Poll Everywhere is a pretty interesting technology. There are a number of these that you can use where students can vote in class. Poll Everywhere is one where they can actually vote with their phones. Again, you have to decide whether you want them to be using your phones in class. But it is a technology that's available. Zoom polling is out there as well. So there are a number of these technologies. You can poll the class and get a sense of what they think on a particular topic, or what they think the answer to a particular question is. And then you can engage them in teamwork. You can give them a problem, right, to solve, or a task to complete, and ask them to collaborate on that, work as a team on that, and then share out what they've done. So over the course of an hour and 15-minute class, you've got some plenary discussion, maybe a little lecture. You've got a video and they're reacting. You've got students getting up to write things on the board. You've got polling that might be happening, and you've got teamwork that's going on. So every 7 to 10 minutes, you're shifting the pace and the flow. You're keeping students engaged, right? You're getting them to talk to one another and to you and to share, and very important. Just asking them questions and having them respond, that's not engagement, right? If you do that all class long, Q&A, 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 you'll lose them. You'll lose them. You've got to do more than that. Interactivity does not equal engagement. I think that's one of the things I've learned over the years. You know, I started out as a professor thinking it was all about interactivity. And I learned pretty quickly that, no, that doesn't equal engagement. It's really important. Really important. So thinking about this idea is really key. What's going to be my pace or flow? How do I either change topic or change mode of instruction? It's one of the two, topic or mode of instruction, right? Every 7 to 10 minutes, so that I can keep them engaged, deepen their learning, and I'm trying to get them to engage in active learning, right? I don't want to be talking at them too long. I want them to do something with it. I want them to do something with the material. And so changing the pace and flow goes hand in hand with active learning that you're trying to engage them in. So, so important. Coupled with that is the idea that over the course, not just of a class, but thinking over the course of a semester, you should be thinking about pedagogical variety. Now, this is something that, you know, I will admit was not my strong suit. You know, I started my career as a professor at Harvard Business School on the faculty, and we taught at the time almost strictly by the case method. Case study after case study. Students would do 2 to 3 case studies a day with different professors, and they'd march along doing hundreds of case studies per month, right? What we've learned, of course, over the years, and I've learned certainly, is that while the case method is wonderful, it's more active learning than the kind of passive learning that takes place in a lecture. Well, you know, it still troubles me, right? Because there is still this redundancy, you know, over time. Wait, it's more active than a lecture, but if it's the same thing every day, you know, we're doing another case. Might be a different industry, different company, but is that really engagement? So what I've come to believe is that pedagogical variety, right, sprinkled throughout a course is really important, with an emphasis on active learning experiences, but different kinds, if you will. So a few that I really like. We start with the case, right? And so I've written a lot of those. Here's one that I wrote recently on Planet Fitness, which is one of the largest fitness centers here in the United States, and now beginning to branch into some other countries. That's one method, right? Then we have teamwork, right? Asking students to solve a problem or a puzzle and working collaboratively. That might be another thing that we do as a, you know, and that may be a whole session or part of a session. I've built simulations, and that's been a powerful way. So Sandy mentioned the Everest Leadership and Team Simulation. We put students in an experience, Amy Edmondson and I built this, where they go through a virtual climb of Mount Everest. This is a 2-hour experience. They work in teams of 5. They have to collaborate intensely to solve a series of problems that we throw at them in this simulation of climbing Everest. And they learn some fundamental lessons about group dynamics that we're trying to teach, and about the challenges of goal misalignment and information sharing in teams. So this is this powerful experience in a really compelling sort of setting, if you will. And you can really have fun with that simulation too. In addition to the computer-based simulation, sometimes I have students dress up and do other things that can really bring that session to life. Or if you want something a little shorter, we've also created some simulations. There's one I created called the Food Truck Challenge, which can be done in just 15 to 25 minutes. So much more compact kind of simulation on the computer that can be a great way to engage students. You might say, wait, simulations, they're expensive. I don't know, there's a lot of big learning curves sometimes for me to learn as an instructor. You know, can I do that? But don't have to always be an elaborate computer-based simulation. Although I would say we've tried, right, to provide teaching materials that make these relatively easy to adopt. There's still some work to be done there. What can we do? What can we do? Well, we can use paper and pencil based exercises and games to engage the student. They can be very low cost, very simple. You know, there's one I use, which some of you may have heard of, called the ballpoint game. And it's a game that was invented by people, software developers and consultants, trying to introduce agile software development techniques inside of corporations. And they developed this little game called the ballpoint game with hundreds of ping pong balls in teams of anywhere from 8 to 25 people. And so this is, for me, a wonderful, if I'm teaching design thinking and I want to teach them the power of iterative problem solving, then I use this game as a great way to teach the concept. And the discussion centers on all sorts of interesting things about how we learn, why we struggle to iterate, how we have a hard time breaking mental models, the difficulties of accepting feedback, all sorts of powerful lessons that I can teach, right, coming out of this game. And oh, games, they're competitive. Sometimes we want to focus on collaboration. That's part of engagement. So having teams work together to solve a puzzle, that's really powerful and collaborative. Sometimes in the simulations or in that ballpoint game, we're asking them to compete, and competition is a way also at times to do this. And so one final way we do it is partnering with corporations or nonprofits or other entities, public sector agencies, to sponsor projects for our students to work on, where they're hands-on developing solutions for organizations. Sometimes those organizations are even willing to make it a competition and award prizes. In this case, Target has for years sponsored a competition on our campus where hundreds of students work on a particular challenge that Target presents them, and they get awarded some cash prizes by Target managers who judge, not the faculty, on what they've done. So you see, there can be all sorts of ways we introduce variety, not just within the session, but across the semester. It's really, really powerful. It's very important to think about. Variety is key to pedagogy, Now let's go back to inside the session, You know, I mentioned that I was taught, you know, by the case method, doing my MBA, and then as a teacher initially. But I think, you know, that what I've learned is that even when we use something like a traditional, whether it's a lecture, whether it's a case study, we can have these collaborative bursts that we can inject into those classes where we ask students, in a sense, to kind of solve a puzzle or a mystery that we put in front of them. A question, can you solve this? Can you figure out what's going on here? And have them work collaboratively to do it. And this can be a great way to pique their interest, get them working, and it's a break from the lecture, the presentation, the discussion that might be happening. And in this case, let me give you an example. So I teach a case study about Trader Joe's. One of the things that they're learning, they've done some pre-work, is they've learned how to apply DuPont formula analysis, some financial techniques, to analyze the performance of companies. So they read this case in Trader Joe's, they've done some analysis, they've done some pre-work, they've submitted a memo to me, right, where they are going to, you know, show that they can do this analysis. They come to class, we're discussing the case, they're sharing some of their analysis they're done, we're reviewing and making sure they understand how to do that DuPont analysis. Then I stop. I say, okay, we're going to take a break from discussing Trader Joe's for a moment. I said, you're all going to go onto our course management platform. There's a little document there, right, for you to look at. I said, I've given you 2 companies. I'll just give an example. One time I did this with, I gave you 2 companies in the computer business. I said, and I've given you some financials. One of them is Apple and the other is Lenovo. I'm not telling you which is which. You can't Google it. You can't look up who these financials are which. Just based on what we've learned about how to interpret ratios, run these calculations, and analyze them, see if you can guess which firm is Apple and which is Lenovo. And if they really understand DuPont analysis, they can solve the mystery. They can figure out which is which, and they can articulate it to the class. So they work collaboratively for like 15 minutes. They do that. It reinforces, did they really understand what we just did in their pre-work and in the first 25 or 30 minutes of class? I'm going to give them a new task, disconnected from the material they've worked on before class. Can they apply what they've learned and solve this mystery, if you will? And I'll do a lot of these. I'll do these if I'm teaching the 5 forces, which is a framework for understanding why some industries are more profitable than others. I might say to them, we've done this case study on Planet Fitness. We've been analyzing the fitness center industry using all this information in this framework. Now, here's some industries, and I'll assign different industries to different groups. And I'll say quickly in 10 minutes, see if you can figure out which of these industries is most profitable, which is least. And how would we use the framework to figure that out without looking anything up, just by applying the concept? So these little bursts of collaboration around a puzzle or a mystery can be a great way to engage. Okay, back to a poll, another poll for you, about how effective you are in encouraging your students to engage with the course material prior to coming to class. Let's get folks to talk a little bit about this. I'll give you about 20 seconds or so more. How effective do you think you're doing at this? Okay, we are going to close out the poll in about 5 seconds. Here we go. And we'll show you the results. 47% of you said somewhat effective, and 10% highly effective, which is really wonderful. So that's really great. That's a significant, majority of you that are either effective or highly effective at doing this. But we've got others who, it seems, are struggling. And look, I've struggled at times too with this. But if you really want to have an engaging session, well, it would be helpful if the students come in having done some work, having grappled with the material in some way, because then you can build off of that to build a really good hands-on learning experience. If they come in a blank slate, you're going to find yourself going, oh no, do I have to lecture to them just to get them up to speed in some way before we can have a discussion? And will I lose them in that time trying to do that? This is really challenging. So how do I do it? Well, it starts with whatever you assign them to do. You got to think, what's the hook? So what? A lot of times professors think, well, what I need to do is make sure that I've tied this pre-work to their grade somehow, so they're compelled to do the pre-work. Okay, yes, that matters, and I do tie it to their grade, that they do the pre-work, whatever I've given them to do. But more important than, is it graded? Will it count? That matters. Students care about that a lot. Emotionally, psychologically, there's the so what, right? Do they care? What's it matter to them? What's the implication for them, right? Why will it matter either in their career, in their next class, in whatever they're passionate about outside the classroom? What's the so what? And can you articulate that? What's the hook? And you're not just doing that. We often think that's what we have to do at the beginning of a class session to motivate the students for the rest of that class. But I would argue the so what matters before the class. You have to articulate the so what when you give out the assignment of whatever pre-work you're asking them to do, so that they're motivated to do it and do it well, and not just check the box to get credit on their grade for having done that. So the so what, right, is so important. So my colleague Amy Edmondson and I and Richard Bomer at the Harvard Business School, we, along with two phenomenal research associates, Erica Furlins and Laura Feldman, and a great team at the school, built something called the Columbia Final Mission multimedia case. It's this rich experience students go through where they actually are standing in the shoes of key players at NASA who were there during the unfortunate days leading up to the catastrophe when the Columbia shuttle disintegrated upon return to Earth after 2 weeks in space in 2003. And so the question is, well, we are all excited about this material. We built this great case. It's this rich multimedia experience. Oh my goodness, students are going to love it. But it's actually, pretty lengthy to prepare. They got to spend a good 90 minutes going through the various videos and other rich material in this multimedia case. So you have to ask yourself, how do I get them to see the so what? Why does this matter? Why is it important? Because I've got to get them to invest a lot of time. Once they invest, I think they'll go, wow, that was a really cool, very interesting multimedia thing. They'll get drawn in. A lot of times students spend far longer than the 90 minutes preparing for class. But how do I get them there in the first place, right? Kind of recognize that just as I built something cool, or I think this is an important moment in space travel that in a terrible tragedy, that's a powerful learning moment. Do they think that? Do they know that? I mean, these days now we've got students who weren't even born when this happened. So what's the so what? And so I go right to the headlines, right? And I talk to them about things like the Boeing 737 MAX crisis, or I talk to them about, COVID-19 and some of our problems reacting quickly enough to the early signs that COVID was going to be a serious, serious international catastrophe. So I relate it to these things that are current in the news that matter to them. And COVID's a good one, right? And I say, oh, so we sometimes downplay what Amy, Richard, and I call ambiguous threats. I go, see how we did that with COVID? We downplayed the threat. Do you remember that? And I say, we're going to learn all about why people do that. We're going to look at that in the context of Columbia Shuttle. We're going to relate it back to what's happening today with COVID. The so what, they dive in, right? Now they're compelled, if you will. Really powerful. What do you ask them to do before class? Think for a moment to yourselves. Write down maybe, what do I ask them to do before class? What do I ask them to do? For many of us, it's reading. We're asking them to do some reading, and maybe we're asking them to write about it. Right? And I'm not suggesting we should stop having them read. But reading isn't the only way to prepare them to then engage during the class session. And we have to broaden our perspective on what pre-work is and think creatively about it and use technology to really help us. And so a couple of things I do that are inexpensive or free and that are very simple to learn and use. So I create tutorials on an app that's called Show Me. Now this is an app for Apple products, use it on my iPad. There are similar apps that you can use on other devices, on other platforms, right? But what these are is they turn a tablet into a whiteboard and they record your voice as you write on the whiteboard, sort of like a Khan Academy video, if you will. They don't see your face on this particular app. You can use different colors, you can bring images, you can bring numbers in, you can do a variety of things here, and you can record yourself. I don't bother with making it look super neat. Mine are somewhat crude, as you can see here. There's nothing super fancy about it. But here, back to the DuPont analysis, I'm teaching them DuPont analysis so they can understand what we're going to talk about in class when we get there, right, if you will. And these are typically pretty short. So, the recorded lectures that people use in this flip the classroom model, hour-long things you want students to watch before coming to class. No. All you've done is take the worst of passive learning in the classroom and put it on the web. You haven't improved teaching and learning by doing that. We don't want to take and ask them to try to sit through that very lengthy one. I made that mistake when I first started recording work in this sort of flip the classroom model. Now I realize keep them short, Mike, and really focus them on a particular topic or question, and then get them to do something with whatever's on that video, if you will. In this case, a quick video, 8 or 10 minutes, whatever it is, maybe less on this. Then go work some numbers in the Trader Joe's case and apply what I've talked about in the video. Then come to class and we'll work some more on it. Then we'll do that puzzle about Apple and Lenovo, and we really master the concept. So breaking it down, and Show Me video tutorials are really great. Another one is Audacity, which is a free software that you can podcast. I don't do any editing. I create short podcasts. They can listen on the go. They can listen on the exercise bike, in the gym, in the car, whatever it might be. No editing. I have some simple bullet points that go over a key topic. Again, these are things where you don't need to be on camera. I know many of us worry about being on camera and how much work that is, and maybe then you feel like you have to do a lot of editing. But both Show Me and Audacity are ones where I'm not on camera. Sometimes being on camera is important, seeing your face. So you don't want to only use these kinds of things when you're not on camera. But I just want you to know it's not always about video, preparing to engage. And lastly, sending them out into the world. This is really important, right? Sometimes the best thing you can have them do is go out and be anthropologists. Go out and observe or interview people about a topic and then come to class. Students actually really like this task, right? And you can find some great fodder for observation and for interviews, often on campus, in the community, in their homes. Even during COVID, when we were fully remote last spring, I found ways to get them, even within their homes, to do a little bit of interviewing and observation that sometimes I could relate to a topic in class. And so the ability to get them to do that, it's all about preparing to engage, which is really key. And remember, it's preparing actively. So we don't want them to just read something, then come to class, having done nothing with that reading. We want them to do something with the material in some way, to actively work it before they come to class. That's going to more likely trigger engagement than just flat reading a book, reading a case, reading an article, etc. So we want them to read, but if we're going to have them read, they've got to do something with it. Or if they watch this little video, they're going to do something with it, then they're going to come to class. This is going to be really key. So preparing actively. I've mentioned a lot of examples. You'll note I like to use really compelling examples. Mount Everest, smoke jumpers at Man Gulch in Montana, the Columbia Space Shuttle accident. You know, I'm a business school professor, but I don't just teach about Google and Facebook and a number of companies, Tesla, etc. I try to use things that I think are really compelling, right? That will capture their attention, that will even shock them sometimes, right? And I also try to think, you know, what does a 19 or 20-year-old care about, or a 25-year-old MBA student, whatever it might be. So thinking carefully, even when I use business cases, I'm thinking, you know, if I have a choice between, you know, a steel manufacturing company and, you know, a film studio, can I accomplish the same learning objectives with the film studio case? Because they're probably going to be more interested in that, right? So thinking carefully about what's compelling to them, right? Not sacrificing learning. Sometimes you're going to study some industries, some topics, some settings that maybe aren't so compelling. But again, looking at the flow of your whole semester, have you got enough of these that are going to be really compelling, that they're naturally going to be motivated to study it? Now, for a moment, stop for a sec. Think to yourself, when you were a student again, how did you study for exams? What did you do? Imagine yourself back in the library, you know, whatever university you're at, or at your home, or in your dorm room. How'd you study? What were you doing? Were you rereading the text? Were you highlighting text or going back to your highlights? Were you reviewing your class notes? A lot of our students spend a lot of time doing those things, rereading and reviewing their notes, going back to their highlights, rereading the text. What do you notice about all those things? They're all very passive. Right? They're all very passive. And so one of the things we want to do is teach them the power of retrieval practice. This is very important because if we want them to be engaged, we also have to think about what they're doing outside of class to help themselves learn. Because if they're mastering concepts and they're feeling this power of self-efficacy, they're more likely to be engaged in class. If they're going back and they're just rereading the notes and confused, and then they do poorly because all they did was passively review material, it's hard to be engaged in a sustained way over the course of the semester. So we teach them retrieval practice. What I do is I say, hey, what is retrieval practice? That's when you have to do something with the material and be able to retrieve concept, you know, deep in your memory and practice with it. So quizzing yourself or quizzing other students is a great way of a retrieval practice, of engaging the material, right? And so there's some software you can teach your students to use on this. One that I like is called Quizlet. Quizlet is a great little thing where they can create flashcards for themselves. And then they can use those flashcards to study for tests and exams. What a powerful little piece of software. It's free. Students can use it. They can share their cards with others, but I tell them, don't do that because the power is in making the card and then quizzing yourself or others, not just using someone else's cards. You get more power from making your own flashcards. So retrieval practice, quizzing yourself, is one example of this, where you're working the material. But how are they working the material? And I show them the evidence from the research shows you will learn more. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was teaching first-year students, and this young man came to my office, and he said, Professor, I don't understand. I studied so hard. I failed the first 2 quizzes. And I asked him how he studied. And he said, oh, I highlight when I read the text and go back and look at my highlights and reread my notes. Totally passive, right? And I taught him retrieval practice. And I showed him Quizlet. And he started coming in and nailing the test. He comes into my office a few weeks later and goes, did you see my quiz grades? They went way up, Professor. I'm getting hundreds. And I go, yes, I did notice. I did notice. And he goes, that thing you taught me about, that retrieval thing, that really works. And I laughed, right? He never knew that, right? He was just doing that. And what happens? He feels this sense of confidence. He starts actively participating in class more, doing more of the pre-work, right? All of a sudden, I've got a more engaged student because he feels mastery. So this is really key. Okay, this is where you might get a little uncomfortable. Last part, what do I do outside of class and after class? I do engage with them via social media. I don't follow them. I don't follow them on things like Twitter or Facebook or things like that, or Instagram, but I encourage them to follow me, and I will interact with them. I have a blog. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. What I do on LinkedIn, that's the one place for professional reasons where I will connect with them, right? And that's really powerful. But using the blog, using LinkedIn, using Twitter to engage them outside the classroom, that's really powerful. It can be really effective. So that's an optional thing. You may find other ways to do that, but I do find it to be effective. I come back to where we began with knowing your students and letting them know you and building rapport, and so for me, one thing I do is I kind of keep track of what's going on campus. You know, what student excelled at a dance event? What student just went with the a cappella group and traveled to New York City and performed? You know, I try to read the student newspaper, what the university social media accounts are saying. Who just I saw on LinkedIn landed a great internship or job, and I try to jot a note down. I send them an email, or on LinkedIn, I comment under their post and say, congrats on that internship. Oh my goodness, they light up, right? They go, wow, professor watching, and he or she cares about what I'm doing. And they are so grateful for that quick compliment, if you will. Now look, sometimes you have to be tough with students. They're not doing the material, they're not doing the job, but you got to balance that with not just when they're doing well in class, but what are they doing outside of class? Are you showing an interest in the whole student? And that little note, and it can be a handwritten note, it could be an email, it could be a comment on their LinkedIn post, whatever works for you will be really powerful. Because after all, nobody cares how much you know until they know that you care. All right, let me see if I can take a couple questions. I know you've been putting some questions in. So let me see if I can look here to help do this, right? So there's some good questions here. So let me take a look. One that I really like is, psychological safety. You say, how do you adapt the teaching model for a seminar in which there's no grading to motivate participation? I think it's really important, right? So not every class that I have does participation count for a significant portion of the grade. For me, most of the time, it at least has some. But I think there are ways that we can engage and make sure that they feel safe speaking up and where they contribute, even when grading isn't there to motivate. And one way is where peers, right, are kind of holding them accountable for this, right? So this is why having them, pair up and work together, or discuss something, or team up and collaborate, where their peers are saying, well, look, I mean, we're being asked to collaborate, or we're being asked to discuss, and you didn't do the work, or you're not speaking. They're starting to hold each other accountable. Can be really a powerful way to do this, right? And this is also where the cold call, even without the grade, no student wants to, be not ready on the cold call. I do use that as well. But I think the peer-to-peer accountability can be really important. It can be great. So psychological safety, yes, I think it's really important to think it's not always about grading that can motivate them. It is about, being able to engage with their fellow students, and their fellow students expecting of them to be engaged can be a great way to do this. What about with really big classes, or if you teach many different classes? I would say that with bigger classes, when you're teaching bigger classes, this is where the breakout group can be really powerful, whether it's on Zoom or physically where you have them do this. That can be a great way. We can't always do a lot of full plenary discussion because you get so many students. But I think the other thing is the big classes where that breaking up the pace and flow is going to be so important, because you might fall into that tendency to just lecture at them for a very, very long time in that large class. And so thinking about breaking up the pace and flow, using polling, using other things where you can get participation from hundreds of students all at once, right, through technology, through a poll, right, or just having them turn to their neighbor, right, and talk about something really quick. small buzz groups, not like getting together at a table in a more formal way. You can use in big classes. So, how do you guide a wrong answer, or concepts? This is a great one. Like, what happens, right? And Mario's asking this question. I think this is Mario, someone I know who is has used one of my simulations. So maybe he's thinking about particular concepts that I intend to teach, and he's seen students answering correctly. I think it's really key here is that I will help students peel the onion. I won't say, oh, that's wrong, and move on. I'll sometimes say, well, why do you think that? Or what are your assumptions? Or help me understand, right? And help me understand your thinking can be a great non-threatening way to get them to sort of unravel or peel the onion and explain the way they're thinking. And then, turning to other students and say, how did you approach this? And not say, is Sally right or wrong? Is Joe right or wrong? But say, did you approach this differently? Let's get a few different ways people approach this problem or this concept. Get that out there and then use that to then leverage a discussion toward getting to the right answer. So I try not to always say, you're wrong. Instead, I hope the student can sometimes come to that realization, right, through the kind of questions I ask, through the way I get them to uncover their assumptions, can be really key. So I think it's a great question. It's a great question. Let me see if I can take one more really quickly. In more procedural courses, such as accounting, finance, or statistics, do the same engagement tactics and pace changes work? Absolutely, they're even more important, right? You don't want to drown them in a sea of numbers, right? And going through these very technical work and ratios and equations and not find ways to change pace and flow. So I mentioned, I'm teaching a strategy course where I embedded in that, we do use some financial techniques like the DuPont formula. I teach some game theory in that strategy course. So I'm doing some payoff matrices and calculations associated with that. So some pretty technical stuff in economics and finance that are embedded in a strategy course that I teach. But I am using those very same techniques throughout that class, right? Because you may think you're teaching them more, right, when you're lecturing through all that concept. The question isn't how much are you teaching in a given 75-minute session. The question is how much are they learning? And I think we sometimes forget that. And so we think, well, I can't get through as much material if I do what Mike is saying. And I want you to step back and say, is the goal to get through a lot of material? Is the goal for them to learn? If the goal is for them to learn, well, then you have a very different approach. And remember, I'm doing these things outside of class, videos, podcasts, and others, to help augment what's happening in class so I can cover the ground I need to cover. I'm out of time. I thank you very much. So fun to be with you. So fun to share some of my struggles and some of the things I've come up with to try to overcome some of those struggles. And I hope you'll try some of these techniques. And good luck to you as you do. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mike, and everyone for joining today. I hope you found today's presentation helpful. I do want to remind you to look for an email from us probably tomorrow that will include the link to the webinar recording. And please do feel free to forward this email, to share this email with this link with your colleagues. Perhaps they wanted to join and couldn't today. So I do want to draw your attention to the links listed on the slide and also to share with you some information. First of all, if you don't have an educator account on the HBP Education website, I encourage you to register. It is free. And doing this will give you access to teaching notes, course planning tools, free trials of simulations, which I know a number of people were asking about simulations. And of course, it gives you access to the entire catalog of HBP cases and simulations. It is free and very easy to do. And if you're interested in learning more about the materials Professor Roberto uses to energize his students, please check out the collection on our website. It's titled Select Materials to Engage Students. And now I want to tell you about our next webinar. So educators around the world spent the past years, we know, having to adapt quickly to teaching in new environments, and they continue to face numerous challenges. This can easily result in what we will term cognitive overload. In this webinar, Professor Bill Schiano will talk about the importance of focusing on what really matters to help manage the load so that both educators and students get the most from their classes. This webinar will take place on April 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The link to register for this webinar, to register as an educator, and the link to learning more about the materials Mike uses are posted in chat now, and they can also be found on the HBP Higher Education website. I will keep chat open for about 10 minutes to give you time to register for an educator account if you don't have one, to register for our next seminar, our next webinar, and to explore the collection of materials that Mike uses. So thank you again, sincerely, for spending this time with us today. And please do connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Be well.